All right, we are recording. So most of the people that I've had on this podcast are people I know. I'm very fortunate that I happen to know some really interesting people, friends and colleagues who've made very interesting guests. And sometimes we'll meet ahead of time before we record and just to talk about the podcast and what it's all about and give them an idea. And they'll say like, oh, I don't know if I'll make a good guess if I really have anything to talk about. And we'll talk for 20 minutes or so. And I'll say, if I had just recorded this conversation, this would have been a great podcast episode.
Yeah.
So yeah, I'm just going to start recording. And if anything fun comes up, then that's great. And if not, we'll just get to know each other. And then I'll do like the formal introduction and then we'll start. This is Task Time Energy, the purpose-filled productivity podcast. I'm your host, Scott Miller. Welcome to the show. Welcome, everyone. Our guest for this episode is Dr. Nicole Byers, who is a neuropsychologist, a speaker. She's host of the Bold Life podcast and CEO of Rocky Mountain Neurosciences in Calgary, Canada. She has a Ph.D. in clinical psychology from the University of Saskatchewan. She's an Adjunct Research Assistant Professor with the University of Calgary, and she's published articles in professional journals on the topics of brain health and neuroscience. And Dr. Byers helps recovering perfectionists and high achievers get out of the cycle of overwhelming to-do lists, procrastination, and self-doubt so they can achieve their goals without burning out. Welcome, Dr. Byers. It's wonderful to have you here.
Oh, thanks for having me.
Is there anything else that you'd like to share about your background, about your experience, your education, anything else you'd like our listeners to know?
Sure. I must say that some of my interest in productivity and perfectionism also comes from my own experiences. A few years ago, when I was transitioning from what I thought would be my dream job in a hospital here in Calgary to running my own business and my own private practice, I got into a lot of bad productivity habits myself and was working a lot and not spending a lot of time focused on my brain health or my physical health, and ended up burning myself out. So not only have I had the opportunity to work with folks, busy professionals who are struggling to get everything they want to get done in their day, I've been there too. And I use a lot of these strategies myself, which makes it really helpful for me in being able to explain them to folks that I work with too.
Yeah, thank you for sharing that. I think that's really helpful for people to hear. I have talked myself on previous episodes about my struggles with procrastination, and we've had other people as guests who are extremely successful, in their education, in their careers, in their businesses, and yet will very openly say, yeah, I've struggled with procrastination. I've let myself get burned out. And I think it's so helpful for people to hear that, because I don't know what your experience is, but I know some of my personal experience and some of my experience in talking to other people is, I think, when we struggle with these things like procrastination, like getting burned out, like getting overwhelmed, I think a lot of people have this idea that it's just me. I'm the only one who experiences this, or I must be worse than everyone else, And I think it's really helpful to hear that other people have experienced this also and are working to manage it. Is that something that you find?
Yes, definitely. I think a lot of us get into those habits in many areas. Yes, procrastination is one of them, where we feel like when we're doing it, it means something's wrong with us, that we're failing in some way. And that's when that inner perfectionist comes out, right? Oh, I'm procrastinating. No one else seems to be procrastinating. They seem to be getting everything done. There must be something wrong with me. And unfortunately, how our brains then take that message is it can send us into this spiral where we're even less likely to get started, because all of that guilt and that doubt really takes up brain resources and makes us even less efficient.
Yeah. And that one word you said, seem, like everyone else seems to be doing so much better than me. Everyone else seems to not be struggling with this. And it's not until you start talking with people about it that you realize that, sure, we're all getting certain things done and we're all, accomplishing certain objectives that we want to accomplish. And yet still, if you're not with somebody 24 hours a day, so you don't necessarily see what they're struggling with or what they're trying to improve. So yeah, I think that's so important to realize that we're not always seeing what's going on behind the curtains, right?
Yes, absolutely. Especially in our modern social media world, right? It's good to keep in mind that most people only post when they're doing well, right? So you see these people that seem to be having all of this success, and you fail to recognize or notice all the years of hard work and all the difficulties that kind of went on behind the scenes, or even all the help that a lot of people have. That's another thing I feel like we tend to guilt ourselves for, is we feel like we should be able to do it all and we shouldn't really need to ask for help. But so many of those people that we see that are really successful, they have tons of help in many different areas of their lives. And really being aware of that can make it easier for us then to put some of these strategies into play, to be able to delegate when we need to, and do all these other really effective time management strategies that can help us out.
Yeah, that's an excellent point. I think too, the more that we're aware of how much help people have, especially the very successful people we see, and how much help we've received ourselves throughout different, that's something I'm very, very grateful for and very aware of, is the people who've helped me and supported me and been there for me when at really important times in my life. And I think being aware of that, just the gratitude for that is a very wonderful and beneficial feeling. But also maybe that makes us a little more willing to ask for help when we realize that, the more aware we are that, we're not really doing it all on our own and don't have to. Yeah.
Yes, absolutely.
Yeah. One of the things I said I would love to talk to you about, especially considering your background, your experience, your education, is procrastination, and especially like the current scientific thinking about procrastination. Like, what is it really? Why do we do it? So anything related to that you would love to talk about or like to share, I would love to hear more about that.
Yeah. How I usually explain why we get stuck in procrastination from a brain perspective is, the important thing to keep in mind is that your brain likes life to be easy, and it likes life to be comfortable. And for our brains, sometimes that means we focus on the short term. So right now, it is more comfortable for me, for example, to avoid making that phone call to that client that I really don't want to make. And so I procrastinate on it because my brain says, well, it might not go that well. It might be a difficult conversation, so I'm going to procrastinate on it. Or you have a really big project that you need to get started on, but it's so much easier for your brain to do these 20 other small tasks, that busy work on your to-do list, rather than jump into that giant project that you don't really know where to start or how you're going to stay on track. So one of the prime reasons that we end up procrastinating is because it's easier in the short term for our brains. It takes less energy for our brains just to avoid everything in the short term. Again, we all know that's only a short-term benefit, but that's really why our brains want to slip into this default. And it really is a default for your brain. So again, no guilting ourselves when we procrastinate. We all do it. It's going to be our brain's go-to response, especially when we're feeling stressed out and overwhelmed.
So it really is, like so many things, it's our brain trying to do what's best for us, or what is easiest. And it's interesting that you talk about the difference between the short-term benefit and the long-term benefit. It seems like there's an opportunity to, first and foremost, like try to get rid of some of the guilt that we feel about it and the blame that we feel about it, and just say, hey, this is a normal thing. It's a natural thing for our brains to do. What else have you learned about procrastination that you think is helpful for people to know, along those same lines?
Yeah, another really what drives our procrastination as well is often some of we call them core beliefs in psychology, but they're kind of those deep-seated mindset fears that our brain has. So our brain is also really driven by fear. So it's focused on the short-term comfort. I want to stay comfortable right now, and fear or avoidance of anything that might feel uncomfortable. And so, for example, we often procrastinate, especially as high achievers, as busy professionals, on areas where we feel that our confidence isn't quite there. If I am not confident that I can do this project perfectly or the right way, my brain might then procrastinate because it's going to avoid this uncomfortable feeling. It's going to avoid that fear of failure, fear of being negatively judged, fear of not being perfect. And that's really where that inner perfectionist as well can really drive a lot of this behavior. And sometimes I talk to clients about what I call the overachiever to-do list cycle, and that involves a lot of procrastination as well. And what tends to happen there is, as high achievers, as overachievers, we take on a lot. We have 400 things on our to-do list. Maybe we get 3 things checked off today, but then because that inner perfectionist sets these really high, sometimes unreachable standards for us, we feel really bad about that, right? Oh, I only checked 3 things off, but I had 10 things on my to-do list today. And that can trigger some of those negative internal brain responses as well, where our brains say, well, I'm never going to get everything done, so let's procrastinate instead, or let's do all this other busy work, this other stuff that's really not taking me closer to my goals, where I feel rushed, I feel overwhelmed, and that makes it even harder for our brains to focus, for our brains to problem solve, and to get anything done. And we can get into this really vicious cycle where we continue to feel constantly overwhelmed. We procrastinate to try and make things easier in the short term, but really in the long term, like you said, all of that leads to is more out of control schedules and more burnout.
It's really interesting to look at that connection between perfectionism and procrastination and how much that can drive it, especially as you said, for high achieving, people. It sounds like there are 2 interesting aspects of perfectionism to look at. One is the idea that, yeah, I can have 20 things on my to-do list today, and then setting that high expectation for myself that I can do all those things. Even if we were to actually, and sometimes I'll do this with people that I'm, my clients that I'm working with, I'll say, all right, let's sit down and look at each of these things that you want to get done today and talk about how much time each of these is going to take, right?
Yes.
And when you start looking at it very objectively, there's no way you can get them all done. But there's also something that I've seen come into play is the idea of everything, every single thing we do. And I've experienced this myself. I've wrestled with this myself. The idea that if we're going to do something, we have to do it the best we possibly can, right? And that drive, and so there's a lot of maybe resistance to doing it because it's going to take so much effort. It's going to take so much energy to do it that well. Is that something that you see driving a lot of procrastination?
Absolutely. Yes, definitely. That's absolutely right. Our brains say, well, if I can't do this perfect, why get started in the first place, right? Or another type of procrastination that we often get into is really what we call analysis paralysis, where we keep thinking, I'm just going to keep researching the best solution. I'm going to keep figuring out a plan for this, but I never actually get started, right? So you feel like you're still busy. Your brain says, well, I'm still doing work, so I must be busy. I must be making progress, but you're not actually making progress. And what this is doing is causing more work for your brain, because now I have 400 possible solutions that I need to choose from, and my brain feels totally overwhelmed, totally overloaded, and has no idea where to start again. So even when it feels like we're making progress, sometimes we're doing that productive procrastination or those activity avoidance strategies that allow us to avoid making decisions, but we still feel busy. So we feel like we're being productive.
Yeah, that feeling of tricking ourselves into thinking that we're being productive when we're really not moving towards the goal. That's an interesting trap to fall into. I'm wondering what are some strategies that you've found effective, or ways of, like, this is a natural thing, we all do it. So if we do want to move forward on some goals, if we do want to knock some things off our to-do list, accomplish certain things in a reasonable amount of time, what are some strategies that you have found helpful?
Yeah, great question. So first thing I'd recommend is it can be really helpful for your brain to understand, why are you procrastinating in the first place? Our brains are amazing. They can do amazing things, but they make a lot of responses, often without us even being aware. So we can fall into these default patterns, whether that's procrastination, whether that's taking on way too much, whatever that really bad productivity habit is, we can fall into them without even noticing. So taking a few minutes to get our brain focused on, okay, what exactly is going on here? And that might be something as simple as sitting down with your journal for 5 minutes and journaling on things like, why am I procrastinating on this? What am I scared might happen? Because we said usually procrastination is driven by that fear, that avoidance of something uncomfortable, right? What am I imagining might go wrong if I get started? What am I afraid that I might be lacking personally, whether that's I'm afraid that I'm going to mess up, or I'm afraid that I'm not good enough, or I'm not smart enough, or I'm not whatever enough. And once we spend some time getting those thoughts out of our brain, it allows our brain to think about them in a different way. So instead of happening kind of behind the scenes automatically and driving our behavior, we bring them into our more conscious awareness, into the frontal lobes of our brain, really, which are more analytical parts of our brain, through our prefrontal cortex, which allow us to problem solve and to think about these responses without our emotional brain taking over and driving our responses. So taking a few minutes to get to the root of that procrastination can often be enough for your brain to say, okay, now I know why I'm doing this. Maybe I don't need to feel that way. Here's what I can do instead.
So really just taking some of those things that drive our behavior or drive our thinking and that are in the background, and we let sit in the background, kind of driving from the back seat and bringing them more to the forefront, and just facing those feelings, facing those thoughts is sounds like it's helpful. And I love what you're saying about like bringing it to the more analytical part of our brain so that we can see it for what it really is and make more rational decisions.
Yeah, absolutely. Because we often find once we do get that thought into the analytical part of our brain, it doesn't hold as much power. Our emotional centers of our brain are really quick to respond, and they drive our reactions very strongly. And so when we get it out of that emotional response, out of that default automatic response, when we think about things more analytically, it can give us much more perspective. And even sometimes saying those thoughts out loud takes away some of their power for our brain, because your brain can then hear them and be like, okay, wait a minute, that doesn't totally make sense. I don't actually believe this. I don't need to respond that way.
Yeah. It's interesting. I was listening to one of your podcast episodes, and I think you mentioned that in the episode, the idea that the emotional part of our mind is so quick and so good at doing certain things, right? Which makes sense, I guess, from a survival standpoint, the fight or flight reflex, fight or flight response. And I guess realizing that, just being aware of that very often, especially for those of us who like to think of ourselves as rational and driven by reason, just the fact that our emotions are going to jump in really quickly. And that's just a normal response. That seems like that would be helpful.
Yes, absolutely. Especially, I would say, when we are feeling extra overwhelmed or extra pressured. Again, our brain only has so many resources. And so when we are really overworked, maybe it's a busy season. Like right now, we're recording this, we're coming into the holiday season. There's lots of extra stuff going on right now. All of that takes up brain resources. It pulls energy from our brains. And so our brains are quicker to go to those default emotional responses. Even if you notice that you're more cranky when you're overwhelmed, for example, or
right.
You're more quick to feel exhausted by something that wouldn't normally tire you out, that can be a sign that your brain is running low on those resources. And so giving ourselves that time, giving our brains that space to really bring these thoughts out of that emotional reaction can be even more helpful when we're getting to that point of overwhelm.
Yeah, we were talking about that a little bit earlier, and I was telling you I read an article recently about this and found it really interesting. And I think this is something that a lot of people would benefit from hearing and thinking about. It's kind of two things tied together. I recently had a researcher, Dr. Els van der Helm from Netherlands, and she's a sleep researcher, neuroscientist and sleep researcher. And we were talking about all of the ways that lack of sleep affects our cognitive ability and affects abilities that we wouldn't necessarily think or immediately think. I mean, a lot of us think, I didn't get enough sleep, so I just feel tired, but it's affecting our emotions. It's affecting our creativity. It's affecting our analytical abilities. And it was really interesting to read an article talking about how being overwhelmed, this, long term especially, has the same impacts on us and affects all these different cognitive abilities that, again, we wouldn't normally associate with being overwhelmed.
Yeah, definitely. I must say that if I had to go back and change my career, I would study sleep. I agree. I think sleep is so central to our health, to our productivity, to our community. And it is really something that a lot of us lack, right? Most of us aren't getting that high quality sleep that we really need. In terms of overwhelm and how that can impact our thinking skills, our brains, like we mentioned, are really designed to help us react in emergency, that fight or flight response that you responded, right? That's how our brains evolved, is to keep us safe, to be able to respond to short-term stresses. You step out into the street and all of a sudden you see a car coming out of the corner of your eye. Your brain is going to take over and react really fast to get you to step back up onto that curb, right? We are very good at responding to short-term stress. However, most of our stress in our modern world is more long-term chronic stress. There is stress from having really high workload demands in your job, stress from the day-to-day family stuff, stress that's going on in our communities around us with ongoing pandemics and social unrest and so many factors. And all of that really takes a toll on our brains because our brains weren't designed to handle that long-term stress very well. So what happens at a kind of a base biological level is that chronic stress response stays activated. And so our brains are getting spikes of adrenaline, which is our stress response neurotransmitter hormone. And we're also getting higher levels of what's called cortisol, which is supposed to help us reduce that stress response. But when we're in that state of feeling stressed, of feeling overwhelmed, of feeling overworked all the time, our brains are still keeping that stress response going, which means, like you said, it takes a toll on how many resources our brains have left. So it is much harder to control our emotions. It is much harder to remember where you left your phone today or the things that you need to pick up at the grocery store. We are more distractible as well. We're not as good at problem solving when we're in that chronic stress, overwhelmed state. And so just like you said, some of these signs that we wouldn't necessarily think of are signs that our brain is really getting close to burnout, essentially.
Yeah, it's interesting. You talk about limited resources. One of the reasons why I named this podcast Task Time Energy, and I've done workshops called Task Time Energy, because I think it's important to consider all three of those dimensions. Of course, we consider the things that we want to get done, right? The tasks, the time that we have to do them in. But it seems like often the most neglected one is the energy. And I wonder, if you would agree, because I think a lot of us, and I've certainly felt this way myself, we have this kind of feeling that we have this limitless well of mental energy that we can draw from. And, we might think of ourselves as being physically tired, but we often don't think that under certain circumstances, we're just going to burn through our tank of mental energy and that we have to do something to replace that. And I think some of the things that we experience or some of the problems that we experience are because we're not realizing that we need to recharge our brains. We need to recharge our batteries. And is that something that you find too, that people really underestimate that?
Yes, I agree. I think I talk more about energy than I do time when it comes to productivity, because you're right. So often we feel like energy is not the problem, but we usually run out of energy before we truly run out of time, right? We come home from work, we're exhausted, we crash on the couch and binge Netflix for 3 hours rather than being able to do anything else. Or you're sitting at your desk, you've been working on this project for an hour and you just can't seem to stay focused. That's an energy problem, not a time problem necessarily. And so one of the things that I credit with being able to find better balance in terms of my productivity is knowing what tasks drain my energy and what tasks fuel my energy back up, because we're all going to have those things, right? We all have areas that when we do them, we feel energized, we feel excited, we love that part of our job or a part of our life. And we have other areas that when we do them, they're really draining that energy fast. Often the tasks that drain our energy the most are the ones that we struggle with. Anything new is really hard for our brains to manage in terms of energy. I like to give the example of driving to work, because this has probably happened to most people. We've all had that experience where we're driving to work, we're on autopilot, all of a sudden we pull into our office and we have no idea how we got there, right? Our brain has just gone into this routine of, this is the route that I take to work. It doesn't take much energy to drive that usual route to work. But if all of a sudden, I'm here in Calgary and we get crazy snowstorms and a road is closed because the plow hasn't gone through there and you have to divert somewhere else, all of a sudden you might notice that you're turning down the radio so you can focus more. You're telling everyone in the car to be quiet. You're squinting to look at road signs and you're paying a lot more attention to what you're doing. That's taking a lot more energy compared to just using your normal route. And so when we're aware of the tasks in our day that drain our energy, the ones that fill our energy up, we can also use that to plan our days more effectively so that we're getting more of those things done we need to do.
Well, I mean, one thing this, as you were talking, it made me think of is the way that often when we're procrastinating, we're delaying a task. And then we finally get started. It's suddenly like, it's not a problem. You just cruise right through it, because the task itself isn't necessarily demanding that much energy. It's the whole, or whatever feelings, whatever emotions we're feeling or thoughts we're having about the task that makes it hard to start. Yeah, it just seems like there's a really interesting connection there somehow.
Yes, absolutely. All that that uncertainty, that angst, that apprehension that our brains build up, right? Our brains are amazing at creating stories. Our brains are expert storytellers. And so they tell us a lot of stories about how awful this task is going to be. And then we start to believe it, right? Because if my brain is saying this task is going to be awful, it sends signals to my body to trigger that stress response. I get tense, my stomach feels uncomfortable. Just thinking about starting that task feels awful in my body. And then you're right, more often than not, once we start it, it's not as bad as we anticipated. Or if it is awful, at least it's done, right? And it's not there weighing on the back of your mind. Because I think that's something else to keep in mind when it comes to procrastination. Short-term benefits, but that task is never really off your mind, right? If you're avoiding responding to your email, every time you look at your email, your brain's like, oh yeah, I'm avoiding doing this thing. And all of that is burning more resources too.
Yeah, it's the eat the frog metaphor that we use sometimes, right? Like sometimes it's, yeah, even if there is something unpleasant, if you do it, at least it's done, as opposed to the thought of having to do that unpleasant thing lingering for so long.
Yes.
Something I find more and more as a teacher and as a coach is that very often what works for one person doesn't work as well for other people. And so very often when I'm talking with people about time management, one of the first things I emphasize is this is an experiment. And so I might make some suggestions. I might ask, have you tried bullet journaling? Have you tried blocking time on your Google Calendar in ways that you're not doing right now, in ways that you're not blocking time now? Different other types of tools and techniques. But what I always emphasize is we're so used and comfortable in our modern world with quick solutions. Right. If I want to do something, I open up my phone, I tap on a couple things and it's done. And really, when it comes to learning to, I don't want to say like overcome procrastination. I mean, however you want to look at it, manage it, dance with it, make friends with it. But when it comes to things like that, when it comes to managing whatever's causing us to feel overwhelmed and create less of that in our life and more space for the things that we want, there's not necessarily the one size fits all solution. Is that something that you find as well? And I'm wondering like how that connects with the work that you do.
Yeah, I really like that. I like the idea you said of experimenting. And I think that's a really great message to keep in mind too, is you're absolutely right. We have lots of these strategies and these techniques that we can recommend, but just like anything, we all have strengths and weaknesses. What works for one person is not necessarily going to work for another. Even in terms of like what we mentioned earlier, balancing our tasks by what gives us more energy. What energizes me is not necessarily going to be what energizes someone else. The task that I hate doing might be someone else's area of strength, right? And so really giving ourselves that space and that opportunity to practice, to test things out, to experiment is so helpful. And the other benefit I think of having that kind of mindset and approach to changing any habit, including productivity habits, is it avoids us getting into the problem, which can happen a lot, is where we try something, it doesn't work, we throw it all out, throw out the baby with the bathwater, right? This isn't working. This is not going to work for me. I don't know what's wrong with me. Let's just go back to what I was doing before. And that can really set back our brains because, again, it sends our brain into that default resistance mode, right? Of I don't want to feel uncomfortable. So now I'm not going to try anything new again because that felt awful. And it took more energy and more time than I was even doing before. So let's just go back to where things were. And we don't want our brains to slip into that pattern. And so if we adopt an experimenting approach, a practice approach, being aware that, some things might work, some things won't, but we're really focused on long-term, the long game here can be very helpful for our brains. And the one thing I would say there too is we probably need to practice longer than we think. We probably give up a little bit sooner than most of us should when we're trying new things. Keep in mind that we might be working to overcome 20, 30, 40, 50 years of brain habits. That's 50 years of experience that our brains have had doing things this way. So it's going to take some time and probably more practice than we think it's going to unlearn that habit, to retrain our brain. Because once our brains learn something, they are really good at remembering it and they are really good at responding that way. And so we're going to need some practice. We're going to need a lot of practice to train our brain to do things differently. And just as you said, a really great strategy is to start with an area that maybe feels more comfortable, something that doesn't feel like a big reach. Sometimes we have this tendency to try to do too much too fast. And that can also shut our brains down and pull up a lot of that resistance. So those really baby steps, continual progress, continuing to focus day after day is really what's going to get us those results. It's not very fun or very sexy, but that's the way our brains work, right?
Yeah. It is often a little bit more steady, ongoing practice and effort that gets us where we want to go. And yeah, you're right. That's not very sexy and fun as exciting as, all the stuff we see on TV. As we talk about all these topics, procrastination, habits, overwhelm, just the different areas that you work in, is there one thing that you've learned recently or come across recently that you found really interesting?
That is a really good question. What are some of the things that I have not got to think about what I've been reading recently? You know what, actually, book I was just finished reading is Radical Candor by, I want to say Kim Scott. Is that right?
Kim Scott.
Yes,
yeah.
Kim Scott. And so that was there's a lot of interesting things in that book, I must say. But one of the things that I found really interesting from my own knowledge is she talks about people on different trajectories in terms of careers and goals, and how some people she calls rock stars and some people superstars. Right. And so the rock stars are those that are really steady and stable and consistent. The people in your organization that they love their job and they're the rock, right? You can count on them to do things. But the superstars are the ones that are always in constant growth. And that was something that was really insightful for me, because I know that for me personally, I am always on a constant growth path, at least right now in my career. But not everyone works that way. And so really coming back to what we've been talking about is how we have these individual differences. Even knowing what your goals are can be so helpful and so beneficial, because your goals might not be the same as someone else. They might not be the same as your colleagues. They might not be the same as your employers or whoever you're working for. And when we're fighting then these battles where my goals are here, but your goals are here, and we're not really communicating together, that also can cause resistance and hesitation for our brains, right? So even being aware of our own innate tendencies in terms of how we set goals, where we want those driving forces to be in our life. Maybe our goal is not work right now. Maybe it's some other area. And so I want these productivity strategies in place so that I can keep my work at work and have all these other areas of my life that I want to pursue right now. Even being aware of that for ourselves is something that I'm learning that there are differences for all of us there as well.
Yeah, definitely. I love that description that Kim Scott talks about, the difference between the rock stars and the superstars. And that is such a rich topic in itself, right? The idea that I think, first of all, recognizing that in many cases, there's been in I think in our Western world, and I'm sure a lot of societies, emphasis on the superstars. And if you want to succeed, that means constantly moving up the ladder, constantly looking for the promotions and the advances and going from one job to the next. And the people who want that are rewarded very often. And I think people who don't necessarily want that feel sometimes shoehorned into that. And I think that's something that hopefully more leaders start considering. I'll often say, if you have this really valuable antique car that was passed to you from a beloved relative and it needs to be repaired, do you want to take it to the person who's been repairing cars for 6 months or the person who's been repairing cars for 34 years? So there's value in the rock star, the person who just wants to stay in place and do that same job and do it better and better and better every year. And, getting back to our topic, sometimes the most fundamental question I think we need to ask ourselves or ask each other is, why is this important to you? So you have all these things on your to-do list, and why are they important to you? Why are you doing them? And sometimes that leads to an understanding of, well, yeah, this is why I'm procrastinating, or this is why I'm so resistant, or why this is so difficult for me, because this isn't really what interests me or what I really want to be doing. And that's the whole topic there, right?
Yes, very good point. I refer to those as the shoulds on our to-do list, right? The stuff that's on there because we feel like we should be doing it. And you're absolutely right. That is a great place that our brains want to procrastinate, because we're not driven to do these tasks ourselves. They're put there because maybe there's pressure from our employer or our boss. Maybe there's pressure from society. Maybe it's internal pressure from our internal perfectionist, like you said, who says, well, I should have all these big goals and I should be wanting to achieve all of these things all the time, but maybe that doesn't fit with me at this stage or phase in my life. And so maybe then that's what's really holding me back, is this pressure I'm putting on myself to do all these shoulds all the time.
Yeah, and all the time, I think, seems like the key element in what you were saying, because there are things that, I should go to the grocery store because we don't have any food in the house, right? Like there are going to be some tasks that we have to do, just they are kind of required to stay alive. But when that's really like the majority of what we're doing are the things that we feel we should do, and we're really neglecting things that we want to do, when there's a balance there that I think some of us don't necessarily think about. And that's a really good place to look first off. Yeah.
Yeah, definitely. And that's a good point too, is that it is also okay to have stuff that we have to do that we don't really like to do, right? I think that's another false belief that we have, is we feel like we should love everything we're doing all of the time. And that is just not true. And that really sets us up for failure as well, because if I'm not enjoying this thing, if I'm not super driven in this area, even though I have to get it done, I feel again like something is wrong with me, right? Which is not a good message that we want to be giving to our brains, because that drives more resistance and more procrastination. It is okay not to love your job all the time. It is okay not to love everything that you're working on all of the time. That is all okay.
Yeah, the fact that is okay, I think, is a really important message for a lot of people to hear, because there is like a lot of a contrary message that's shared a lot these days, is you should be doing what you love, you should be passionate about what you're doing, and this impression that we should just be driven and passionate and motivated and in love with everything we're doing every second of the day. And I don't really feel that way about raking leaves. I don't,
Right.
I think a lot of people are going to enjoy listening to this. I think there are people who will find this really helpful. I would love to ask you one question that I always ask people at the end of every episode. And that is, what is your dream right now?
That's another good question. You know what? My dream right now, this is a big dream. This is part of my big why, and it's pretty broad and non-specific, like dreams sometimes are, but I want to help create a new generation of leaders who feel confident and in control of their time, like they're not having to make that choice between their career and having a life. That is my dream. That is my big goal.
That's a fantastic dream. And I think that society would benefit from having more of those leaders in ways that we haven't fully wrapped our head around yet. Yeah. So good luck with that.
Thank you.
If any of our guests would like to get in touch with you, learn more about what you do, where can they get in touch with you, or where can they find more information?
Yeah, probably best place is my website. It's drnicolebyers.com. There's links to my podcast, which you mentioned on there, and a lot of other resources and blog posts about productivity, time management, goal setting, and overcoming some of those negative beliefs that we've been talking about, like perfectionism, people pleasing, and procrastination.
Excellent. Thank you so much for joining us today.
Well, thank you for having me.
I will include a link to Dr. Byers' website in the description for this episode so that you can find that link there. And if you haven't done so already, check out my website, scottmillercoaching.com. Also, remember to follow, like, subscribe, or whatever that button is called on your podcast player. Go ahead and click that button so that you can join us back here next time for the next episode of Task Time Energy, the Purpose-Filled Productivity Podcast. Thanks for listening. Take care.